Close your eyes and picture the island, the Taino, called Boriken, meaning Land of the Valiant Lord. It sits in the Greater Antilles, nestled between Hispaniola to the west and the Virgin Islands to the east, where the Caribbean Sea meets the Atlantic in a collision of blue that looks like paradise from above. Before any European ship scraped its hull against these coral reefs, this was home to tens of thousands of indigenous people who had been farming yucca, playing Beatty ball, and carving petroglyphs into stone for centuries. When Christopher Columbus sailed past in 1493 and claimed to have discovered it, the Taino were already running trade routes to Cuba and Jamaica, irrigating crops, and practicing a spiritual cosmology so sophisticated that Spanish chroniclers like Ramón Panay struggled to comprehend it. The Spanish renamed it San Juan Bautista, then Puerto Rico, then got confused and swapped the names around until the island became Puerto Rico and the capital became San Juan. Classic imperial efficiency. But here's what the Spanish did understand. This island had gold, strategic positioning, and fertile soil. Over the next 5 centuries, that understanding would fuel genocide, enslavement, plantation economies, military occupation, and 9 major uprisings that refused to let conquest have the final word. The mountains remember everything. By the late 1400s, Boriken hums with the ordinary rhythms of Taino civilization. Picture the mangrove forests near Luquillo, where fishermen haul nets full of snapper and lobster at dawn, their canoes cutting through water so clear you can see the coral gardens below. Or the freshwater springs around Utuado, where women gather to wash cassava root, their hands moving in practiced rhythm while they share the day's news about marriages, disputes, harvests, and the rumors that travel faster than any canoe. This isn't some primitive Eden waiting for European enlightenment. This is a functioning society with agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and political organization that would impress any contemporary Mediterranean city-state if Europeans had bothered to look closely instead of immediately calculating extraction rates. The Taino grow yucca in raised garden mounds called conucos, a technique so effective that it maximizes yield while preventing erosion, developed through centuries of observation and adaptation. They play a ceremonial ball game in stone-lined plazas called batis, complete with rules, referees, and regional tournaments that settle disputes and strengthen alliances between communities. The game isn't just sport. It's diplomacy, ritual, entertainment, and political theater all at once. They build bohíos, circular homes with palm-thatched roofs engineered to withstand hurricanes better than half the modern construction you'll see today. Because when you live in the Caribbean, you learn to respect the wind or you don't survive. And they govern through a network of caciques, regional chiefs who maintain power through kinship ties, strategic marriages, diplomatic negotiations, and the occasional strongly worded message about respecting territorial waters and fishing rights. Trade canoes move constantly between islands carrying salt, tools, cotton, food, ceremonial objects, and probably some quality chisme about who's feuding with whom. When Columbus bumps into the Caribbean in 1493, he's not discovering anything except his own geographical incompetence and Spain's appetite for wealth. The Taino already know exactly where they are, where every reef hides beneath the surface, which currents run strong in hurricane season, and how to read weather patterns that European sailors can barely comprehend. Spanish chronicler Ramón Panay arrives later and writes one of the earliest ethnographic accounts, documenting Taino religion with barely concealed confusion. He describes semillas, sacred objects carved from stone or wood representing ancestors and nature spirits, and rituals honoring Yucahu, the spirit of cassava and the sea. He records creation stories about how the first people emerged from caves, how the sun and moon were created, how death entered the world. What Panay can't quite grasp is that this isn't superstition or primitive belief. It's a complete philosophical system connecting people to land, memory, and each other, with ethical frameworks and spiritual depth that rival anything in Europe. But by 1508, rumors filter across the Mona Passage from Hispaniola about Spanish encomiendas, forced labor, entire villages decimated by disease and brutality. The Taíno know what's coming. They've seen the smoke rising from burning villages across the water. In 1508, Juan Ponce de León steps onto Boriquen's shores with official Spanish paperwork, a mandate from the crown to extract wealth, and the confidence of a man who has never considered that no might be an option, or that the people already living here might have opinions about his plans. He brings soldiers equipped with steel and firearms, priests carrying crosses and certainty, bureaucrats with ledgers already prepared to count gold, and an economic plan that boils down to take everything, pay nothing, call it civilization, and punish anyone who objects. At first, there's an attempt at diplomacy, or what passes for diplomacy when one party has already decided the outcome. Aguebana the Elder, one of the island's most powerful caciques, tries to assess whether coexistence is possible, whether these strange men with their metal skin and explosive weapons might be negotiated with, contained, or perhaps convinced to leave. He performs the Guatiao ceremony, a ritual of brotherhood, with Ponce de León trading names and pledging mutual respect. Spoiler: it doesn't work. When Aguebana the Elder dies in 1510, leadership passes to his nephew, Aguebana II, remembered in oral history as El Bravo, the fierce one, the warrior who refuses accommodation. He's watched Spanish demands escalate from requests to requirements to outright theft. By 1511, the situation has become impossible to ignore or negotiate. Tribute in gold that doesn't exist in sufficient quantities. Labor requirements that look suspiciously like slavery. Land confiscation justified by documents written in languages the Taíno don't read. Conversion requirements backed by violence. Submission demanded without reciprocity. A Spanish report from that year complains that the Taíno refused obedience and showed contempt for His Majesty's representatives, which is colonial bureaucrat speak for, they figured out we planned to enslave them, and they objected strenuously with weapons. Aguebana II organizes what historians call the Taíno Rebellion of 1511, a coordinated uprising that stretches from Yahuecas in the north to Añasco in the west, involving multiple caciques and hundreds of warriors who have spent months planning this moment. Warriors attack Spanish settlements at dawn, burn outposts, destroy records and supplies, kill colonizers who resist, and force the survivors to retreat into hastily fortified positions. This isn't random violence or desperate reaction. It's strategic warfare that uses intimate knowledge of terrain, cuts Spanish supply lines, targets isolated outposts first, and demonstrates that the Taíno understand exactly what kind of fight this is and what's at stake. Spanish chroniclers later describe the uprising as savage chaos, unprovoked aggression, incomprehensible barbarism, but the coordination and timing tell a different story. For months, the rebellion holds Spanish forces in check, reclaiming territory and making colonization look like the expensive, dangerous mistake it is. Then come the guns in concentrated force, the war dogs trained to tear flesh, the cavalry charges against fighters on foot, and worst of all, the diseases. The combination devastates indigenous populations across the island, with terrifying speed. Some Taino die in battle, fighting with wooden clubs and fire-hardened spears against metal armor and gunpowder. Many more die from smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases their immune systems have never encountered, and against which they have no defense. Entire villages are emptied by epidemics that Spanish soldiers treat as evidence of divine favor. Survivors face an impossible choice: submission or flight. Many flee to the mountains, to the same interior highlands where they once hunted and performed ceremonies, now transformed into refugee zones where Spanish soldiers rarely venture. There they intermarry with escaped Africans who will arrive in coming decades, sharing survival strategies, agricultural knowledge, and resistance techniques that eventually evolve into the rural Jibaro culture that will define Puerto Rican identity for centuries. Indigenous Puerto Rico doesn't disappear despite Spanish claims of complete conquest. It adapts, hides in plain sight, endures in mixed heritage communities, and eventually re-emerges in the broader population that will carry resistance forward through new forms and strategies. The genocide of indigenous peoples creates what Spanish colonial authorities politely call a labor shortage, which is empire speak for "we killed everyone who lived here, and now we need replacements to extract profit from land we stole." Spain's solution arrives in chains aboard ships that treat human beings as cargo. By the 1520s, the Asiento system formalizes contracts granting Portuguese, Dutch, and later English merchants the legal right to import enslaved Africans into Spanish Caribbean colonies. It's human trafficking dressed in official paperwork, blessed by church authorities who rationalize slavery through tortured biblical interpretation, and motivated entirely by greed. Puerto Rico becomes a node in the transatlantic slave trade, its ports receiving ships that cross the Middle Passage carrying people kidnapped from their homes. By 1530, ships regularly carry people from the Kingdom of Congo, from Senegambia, where the Wolof and Mandinka empires trade, from the Gold Coast, where Akan states dominate commerce, all torn from their lives and transported across an ocean that kills roughly 15% of its human cargo before landfall. Those who survive arrive at Puerto Rican ports like San Juan and Ponce, where they're sold to plantation owners eager to cash in on the sugar boom that's transforming the Caribbean into Europe's sweetener supplier. Sugar mills rise near San Germán and Ponce, massive stone structures housing trapiches, the grinding wheels that crush cane stalks between heavy rollers. Every turn of that wheel is powered by human suffering that plantation accountants categorize as operating costs, and church officials rationalize as bringing Christianity to heathens, as if salvation justifies torture. An archival ledger from 1544 survives in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, listing enslaved people by age, ethnic origin, physical condition, and temperament. Names are stripped down to inventory numbers or replaced entirely with Spanish ones. Conditions are described like livestock assessments at market: strong, suitable for field labor, experienced in ironwork, problematic. That last term, problematic, is colonial code for resists authority. It appears with surprising frequency, suggesting that resistance begins immediately, often before the ship even docks. Daily life on a sugar plantation is designed to break the human spirit through sheer, relentless brutality and dehumanization. The work cycle begins before dawn, when overseers ring bells or blow horns to wake enslaved workers from barracks barely adequate for sleeping. Cutting cane under tropical sun that feels personal, that turns the air into soup, that causes heat stroke and dehydration that plantation owners treat as laziness. The cane itself is weapon. Sharp leaves that cut exposed skin, heavy stalks that strain backs and shoulders, endless rows that stretch toward horizons that never seem closer. Surviving on rations Europeans wouldn't feed animals. Cornmeal, salted fish if you're lucky, occasionally plantains or yuca, always insufficient for the calories burned in labor. Sleeping in barracks built to warehouse bodies, not shelter people, structures without privacy or comfort, designed to prevent rest from becoming restoration. Working until your hands bleed from machete handles, then working more because stopping means the whip. The overseer's lash is ever-present threat and frequent reality, leather or rope applied to backs for infractions real and imagined. Working too slowly, talking back, showing insufficient deference, simply existing in ways that challenge the fiction of subhuman status. But here's what the plantation owners never quite manage despite all their violence and surveillance: complete control. Enslaved Africans resist from day one in ways large and small, individual and collective. They work slowly, breaking the rhythm of production, without doing anything overtly punishable. A deliberate inefficiency that costs owners money while maintaining deniability. They damage tools in ways that look accidental: a hoe handle that somehow splits, a machete that mysteriously dulls too fast, a cartwheel that develops wobbles. They rescue each other from punishment, distracting overseers or taking blame to spare others. They preserve languages despite prohibitions, speaking Kikongo and Wolof and Akan in whispers, teaching children words that connect them to ancestors and homelands. They sing to those ancestors at night, songs that encode messages and maintain spiritual connections that slavery tries to sever. They practice religions in secret, blending African traditions with Catholic saints in syncretic forms that fool Spanish priests while preserving deeper truths. And they hold on to humanity that Spain tried to price out of existence, maintaining dignity and community in circumstances designed to destroy both. Before Puerto Rico has 9 documented uprisings that make it into official records, it resists every single day in 1,000 quiet ways that don't generate reports, but keep hope alive and sanity intact. By the mid-1500s, enslaved Africans start doing what any rational person would do when facing impossible oppression and recognizing that legal freedom will never be granted voluntarily. They run. Cimarron communities begin forming in the mountains of Loiza, in the dense tropical forests around Luquilo, where Spanish horses struggle and soldiers get lost. In the interior highlands near Calle and Aybonito, where terrain becomes vertical and loyalty to Spain means less than survival skills. A Spanish colonial report from 1570 complains that runaways dwell in inaccessible places and refuse capture despite repeated military expeditions, which translates to, "They outsmarted us. They know this terrain better than we ever will, and we're too embarrassed to admit how badly they've outmaneuvered our professional soldiers." These maroon settlements aren't just hiding spots or temporary camps. They're functioning communities with elected or consensus-based leadership. Cultivated agriculture growing yucca and plantains and beans. Sophisticated defense systems including lookout posts and planned escape routes. And rich cultural life that maintains African traditions while adapting to Caribbean conditions. One documented leader, Guayama, the name later given to a town, which tells you something about his significance, commands a settlement so well defended that Spanish troops avoid engaging except in overwhelming numbers, and even then, they often lose more than they gain. Oral histories passed through generations describe warning drums echoing through the hills whenever soldiers approached, an early alert system more effective than anything Spain had. The drums used talking rhythms borrowed from West African communication systems, sending messages about troop movements, danger levels, and whether to hide or prepare for battle. Think of it as the Caribbean's original emergency alert system, except it actually worked and didn't require everyone to have a phone. These communities practice African religions openly once they're beyond Spanish reach, building shrines to orishas and ancestors, performing ceremonies that maintain spiritual connections to homelands across the ocean, and training younger generations in traditions that slavery tries to erase. They farm collectively, sharing labor and harvest according to need rather than profit, creating economic systems based on mutual aid rather than extraction. They shelter new escapees, providing food, orientation, and integration into Maroon society. Understanding that every person who escapes weakens the plantation system and strengthens their own communities. And occasionally, when supplies run low or when justice demands it, they raid plantations for food, weapons, tools, and the deep satisfaction of taking back what was stolen, reminding plantation owners that control is never total and that every act of violence produces resistance. Life in Maroon communities isn't easy. They face food scarcity, disease without doctors, and constant Spanish military pressure. But it's free. People marry by choice, raise children who will never be sold, bury their dead with proper ceremonies, celebrate harvests with music and dance, and build lives that empire insists are impossible for people of African descent. The Spanish try repeatedly to destroy these settlements, sending military expeditions that crash through forests and climb mountains, burning abandoned camps, and occasionally capturing isolated individuals. But the mountains keep their secrets. Maroons develop intelligence networks that warn of approaching danger, move settlements when necessary, and sometimes negotiate temporary truces that acknowledge Spanish inability to win outright. Freedom in Puerto Rico begins not in legislative halls or royal decrees, but in the highlands where people who refuse to be owned create alternative worlds that prove liberation is possible even when law says it isn't. By the 1600s, Spain has turned Puerto Rico into a military fortress because every European power with a navy wants this strategically positioned island. Fort San Felipe del Morro rises on the rocky point guarding San Juan Harbor, its walls thick enough to withstand cannon fire, and its dungeons deep enough to disappear anyone who questions Spanish rule. The English attack in 1595 under Francis Drake, then again in 1598 under George Clifford. The Dutch arrive in 1625 with ships and ambition. Each time, Spain barely holds on, which makes colonial authorities paranoid about internal threats. A report from 1664 warns that enslaved people maintain communication with foreign enemies, revealing the fear that drives imperial logic. The recognition that oppressed people will always seek allies against their oppressors. While European powers fight over who gets to exploit the island, enslaved Puerto Ricans keep resisting through networks that pass information, songs that encode messages, secret gatherings that Spanish spies can't quite penetrate, and sabotage that colonial authorities can never fully prevent. When pirates raid coastal towns, some enslaved people see opportunities. When rival empires threaten, some calculate advantages. This isn't disloyalty to Puerto Rico. It's clarity about who the real enemy is. Empires see threats everywhere. Enslaved people see opportunities everywhere. The difference is perspective. The first formally documented rebellion of enslaved people in Puerto Rico erupts in 1765 across Bayamón, Toa Baja, and Ponce. Spain's push to intensify sugar production has created conditions so brutal that coordinated resistance becomes inevitable. Colonial archives are sparse on details because Spanish clerks weren't eager to document defeats. But a military report from that year describes collective resistance and insolent defiance, which is bureaucratic code for organized action that terrified authorities. Enslaved workers refuse orders, damage mills, and in several locations rise in open revolt. Spanish forces suppress the uprising with the usual combination of violence and executions. But the message is clear. Puerto Rico will never be quiet. This rebellion establishes a pattern. It shows that enslaved people can organize across multiple plantations, coordinate timing, and act collectively despite surveillance and punishment. It proves that resistance isn't individual desperation, but strategic collective action. And it plants seeds that will grow into larger uprisings over the next century. The first spark becomes a pattern. Resistance is no longer exceptional, it's structural. By 1821, revolutionary winds sweep the hemisphere. Haiti has been free since 1804. Its revolution still terrifying every slaveholding society in the Americas. Simón Bolívar is liberating South America, rewriting the political map, and making independence seem possible. Enslaved Puerto Ricans feel the momentum. In Ponce and Guayama, conspiracies form among enslaved people and free black Puerto Ricans, planning coordinated attacks on plantation owners and a broader uprising that might finally break Spanish control. Spanish archives describe the conspiracy as a Haitian contagion, revealing how empire understands resistance as a disease, something foreign and infectious, rather than the logical response to oppression. One leader, Marcos Chioro, becomes legendary. He organizes enslaved rebels to rise on July 15, 1821, with plans to seize weapons, liberate plantations, and establish free territories. But Spanish authorities intercept communications, arrest participants, and execute leaders in public displays meant to terrify anyone considering resistance. Chioro is killed, but his name survives in songs, oral traditions, and collective memory as a symbol of what could have been and what might still be. Even failed rebellions succeed when they inspire the next generation. The story doesn't end with executions. It continues in whispers. Just 5 years later, in 1826, Ponce erupts again. Enslaved workers revolt after plantation owners impose even more brutal labor demands, testing the limits of what human beings can endure before breaking. Spanish chroniclers mention a disturbance of unusual boldness, which undersells what actually happens. People refusing to cut cane, seizing tools, attempting mass escape, and fighting back when soldiers try to force them into submission. The uprising is short-lived. Spanish forces crush it with violence that makes examples of leaders and terrifies survivors into temporary submission. But the significance isn't in duration. It's in pattern. Resistance is becoming structural, not spontaneous. Each uprising learns from the last. Each generation refines strategy. Each rebellion, even when defeated, teaches the next wave what works and what doesn't. Ponce becomes a center of resistance culture, a place where memory of rebellion stays alive in stories, songs, and the knowledge that freedom is possible because people keep trying to seize it. In 1827, authorities in Guayama discover a conspiracy so extensive it involves enslaved workers, free black Puerto Ricans, and artisans from multiple towns. A trial transcript from that year, preserved in Spanish colonial archives, describes meetings in the woods at night, where participants blend African ritual practices with political strategy and encoded language that investigators struggle to decipher. The plan is ambitious. Burn plantations simultaneously, seize weapons from militia armories, establish free zones in the mountains, and force Spanish authorities to negotiate or retreat. It's the Caribbean blueprint for liberation, adapted to local conditions and coordinated across class lines. Informants expose the plot, often under torture that Spanish authorities apply liberally to extract confessions and names. Dozens are imprisoned. Leaders are executed. The conspiracy collapses. But the dream doesn't die. What the 1827 rebellion reveals is that resistance has evolved beyond spontaneous uprisings. People are planning, strategizing, building networks that cross boundaries between enslaved and free, African-born and Creole, rural and urban. Revolution is no longer a fantasy. It's a rehearsal. The year 1835 brings another revolt, centered again in Ponce, the city that refuses to stay quiet, and spreading to Saint-Germain. The leader, documented in Spanish police records as Santiago Inglés, rallies enslaved Africans and Creoles with a plan reminiscent of earlier Maroon strategies, combined with newer revolutionary thinking, influenced by news from Haiti and South America. The conspiracy involves coordinated attacks on multiple plantations, plans to seize weapons from militia armories, and a vision of establishing free territories that could negotiate with Spanish authorities from a position of strength rather than pleading for mercy. A police report from that year, preserved in colonial archives, complains about too many free men of color influencing the enslaved population with ideas above their station, which is both accurate and revealing. Freedom is contagious. When enslaved people see free Black Puerto Ricans living autonomously, running businesses, owning property, and moving through society with relative dignity, it undermines every justification for slavery that Spanish authorities offer. When free Blacks actively support resistance, providing information, shelter, resources, and inspiration, it creates networks that Spanish authorities can't fully control because they don't know who to trust or where the boundaries between enslaved and free really lie. Spain crushes this uprising too, deploying troops to surround suspected rebel gatherings, capturing leaders through informant intelligence, and executing them publicly to terrorize anyone considering future resistance. But crushing one uprising doesn't stop the growing anti-slavery movement that by the 1830s includes not just the enslaved, but also progressive intellectuals, reform-minded clergy, who have started questioning whether Christianity actually justifies perpetual bondage, and even some Creole elites who recognize that slavery is economically inefficient compared to wage labor and morally indefensible by any standard beyond naked self-interest. The dream of freedom keeps resurfacing, louder and more organized every time, building toward the explosive decade ahead. The year 1848 is brutal. Governor Juan Prim implements the Bando Negro, a racist legal code targeting Black Puerto Ricans, enslaved or free, with curfews, movement passes, corporal punishment for minor infractions, and a surveillance system designed to make freedom feel like a different kind of prison. The law treats Blackness itself as suspicious, criminalizing existence and mobility in ways that make everyday life exhausting and dangerous. Naturally, people resist. In Toa Baja, enslaved workers rise in open revolt, injuring overseers and attempting mass escape. The uprising is suppressed with predictable violence, but its impact extends beyond immediate defeat. The 1848 revolt energizes the abolitionist movement led by figures like Segundo Ruiz Belvis and Ramón Emeterio Betances, Puerto Rican intellectuals who argue that slavery is not just immoral, but incompatible with any vision of national dignity. They begin organizing not just for emancipation, but for independence, recognizing that freedom for enslaved people and freedom for the island are inseparable goals. When laws become shackles, people make keys, and sometimes those keys unlock more than one door. September 23, 1868, Lares. This is the rebellion that becomes legend, the uprising that every subsequent independence movement will reference, commemorate, and draw inspiration from. El Grito de Lares, the Cry of Lares, led by Ramon Emeterio Betances, a physician, abolitionist, and revolutionary thinker, along with Mariana Bracetti, who sews the first flag of independent Puerto Rico, Sotero Figueroa, Matias Brugman, and a network of Afro-Puerto Rican artisans, farmers, laborers, and intellectuals who have been planning this moment for months. The movement seeks complete independence from Spain, not just reform or representation, but a fundamental break with colonial rule and the establishment of a sovereign Puerto Rican nation that controls its own destiny, economy, and future. Archival testimonies from captured rebels describe flags sewn in secret by Bracetti and other women, their needles working by candlelight to create the white cross and star on revolutionary blue that will become an enduring symbol. Meetings held in coffee haciendas under cover of ordinary business, where plantation owners and workers alike discuss revolution in coded language, planning logistics, gathering weapons, and debating strategy. Coded messages pass through trusted networks, using market days and religious festivals as cover for coordination that spans from the mountains to the coast. And a revolutionary proclamation declaring, "Viva Puerto Rico Libre!" Long live free Puerto Rico. A statement that frames independence not as rebellion against legitimate authority, but as the natural right of a people to govern themselves. On September 23rd, hundreds of rebels seized the town of Lares in a coordinated dawn attack. They overwhelm the small Spanish garrison, declare the Republic of Puerto Rico from the town hall steps, free political prisoners held in local jails, and begin marching toward San Sebastian to expand the uprising and capture more territory. For a few hours, maybe a day at most, Puerto Rico is independent. The flag flies over Lares. The Republic exists not just in imagination, but in physical reality. People govern themselves without Spanish permission. Then Spanish troops intercept the march, engage the rebels in battle at Asomante, and overpower them with superior weapons, military training, and sheer numbers. Leaders are arrested and dragged to San Juan in chains. Some, like Brugman, are executed. Others spend years in prison. Many flee into exile, continuing the independence movement from New York, Paris, and other cities where they organize, write, fundraise, and keep the dream alive. The Republic of Puerto Rico lasts less than a day in physical terms, but the memory lasts forever. El Grito de Lares becomes the foundational myth of Puerto Rican independence, the moment when people declared that this island belongs to Puerto Ricans, not to any empire. Defeat becomes identity. The flag sewn by Mariana Bracetti becomes a symbol of resistance that endures through every subsequent struggle, outlawed by authorities, but raised again and again by those who refuse to accept colonial status as permanent condition. In 1897, Antonio Mattei Luberas leads the Intentona de Yauco, another determined attempt at full independence revolt with revolutionary flags, barricades, and detailed plans to seize military posts. Rebels coordinate across southern towns, drawing support from coffee workers and farmers crushed by Spanish taxation. But Spanish intelligence has learned from previous uprisings. Informants penetrate the movement, sometimes for money, sometimes under coercion. Authorities arrest dozens before the revolt launches. Leaders, including Mattei Luberas, flee into exile, joining the diaspora of Puerto Rican revolutionaries in New York, who continue organizing and keeping independence dreams alive. The uprising fails, but timing reveals larger forces. Spain is weakening, its empire crumbling under defeats in Cuba and the Philippines. The Spanish-American War erupts in 1898, ostensibly about Cuban independence but really about U.S. imperial ambitions. When it ends, the Treaty of Paris signed in December 1898 hands Puerto Rico to the United States without consulting a single Puerto Rican. One empire replaces another. The flag changes, but the fundamental relationship remains: extraction, exploitation, control imposed from outside. Under U.S. rule beginning in 1898, sugar corporations expand massively. Companies like South Puerto Rico Sugar accumulate enormous tracts, displacing small farmers. Colonial citizenship is imposed in 1917 through the Jones Act, granting Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship without full rights. Conveniently just in time to draft young men into World War I. Military bases occupy prime coastal land at Vieques and Roosevelt Roads, treating the island as strategic property. English is forced into schools to erase Spanish language and Puerto Rican identity, though this largely fails due to resistance. Economic policies favor U.S. corporations while local businesses struggle. Resentment builds for decades, crystallizing around the Nationalist Party and Pedro Albizu Campos, a Harvard-educated lawyer and World War I veteran who dedicates his life to independence. Albizu argues that U.S. rule is illegitimate because Puerto Ricans never consented, that the island remains a colony despite euphemistic terms, and that decolonization requires complete independence. On October 30, 1950, the Nationalist Party launches coordinated uprisings in Jayuya and Utuado. In Jayuya, Blanca Canales leads rebels who seize the town, burn the post office representing federal authority, and raise the Puerto Rican flag that U.S. authorities had outlawed. They declare independence. Again. The United States responds with overwhelming force. P-47 fighter planes, heavy artillery, National Guard troops. Fighter planes bomb and strafe Jayuya, destroying buildings and killing civilians in the first and only aerial bombardment of U.S. territory by U.S. forces. The scorched buildings still carry that memory. The uprising lasts several days before being crushed. Hundreds are arrested. Albizu Campos is imprisoned in La Princesa prison, where he endures torture including reported radiation experiments that authorities initially deny but later partially acknowledge. He spends years in prison, his health destroyed, becoming a martyr whose suffering crystallizes colonial grievance into enduring symbol. The Ninth Uprising fails like the 8 before it, crushed by superior force and followed by mass arrests and systematic repression that continues for decades. But the pattern across 5 centuries is clear. Puerto Rico will never stop trying. From Aguebana II organizing rebellion in 1511 to Blanca Canales raising the flag in 1950, the demand for freedom echoes across generations, adapting strategies but maintaining the fundamental claim that this island belongs to its people, not to any empire. Drums, flags, mountains, always resistance, always memory. Picture the mountains of Jayuya at dusk. The coquille sings its 2-note call. The air cools, fog curls around the peaks like memory made visible. 500 years of resistance whisper through the leaves. Taino, African, Creole, Maroon, Jibaro, nationalist. History isn't past here. It's ongoing. The mountains remember everything.